Language is a mirror of culture, and if that is true, then Russian alcohol slang is one of the most honest and most ruthless mirrors ever held up to any nation. No other area of the Russian language is as rich, as varied, as precise, and as poetic at the same time as the vocabulary of drinking, getting drunk, sobering up, and returning to drink. English may have a few dozen slang terms for being drunk. Russian has hundreds of them, and each one describes a different shade, a different intensity, a different context, and a different philosophy behind reaching for the bottle. This is not an accident. It is neither a reason for pride nor for shame. It is a linguistic fact that flows directly from a social fact, a historical fact, and a cultural fact, which together make up the Russian relationship with alcohol, a relationship lasting at least several centuries and showing no particular signs of moving toward a resolution. Today we will look at 10 words and expressions from Russian alcohol slang, which are not only linguistic curiosities, but windows into the way millions of people think, feel, and experience reality. The first word, pronounced bukwo, and it is probably the most widely used slang term for alcohol as such in the entire Russian colloquial language. Bukwo is alcohol in the abstract and collective sense, alcohol as a category, as a substance, as a phenomenon, not a specific vodka or a specific beer, but the entire world of strong drinks described by one inelegant, blunt, perfectly understandable word. The etymology of the word is directly connected to the verb bukach, meaning to drink intensively and habitually, which in turn probably comes from an onomatopoeic root describing the sound of pouring liquid. Bukwo is a democratic word. It is used by students, pensioners on a bench in front of the shop, construction workers on break, and middle managers on a company team-building trip. There is no social gradation in it, no judgment, only a statement of fact. There is bukwo, there is no bukwo. I'm going for bukwo. There is a bit of bukwo left. In Russian slang, it functions with the same naturalness as the word beer does in Polish, although it describes a much broader category and a much more serious attitude toward the phenomenon being described. Bukwo is also a word that appears in contexts where its mere presence says everything about how the speakers treat alcohol, not as a pleasure, not as a social ritual, but as a necessity, like air or water, something one simply needs and whose availability one takes care of. The second word, pronounced podat and podatij, and this is one of those words that show Russian linguistic precision in describing alcoholic states. Podat literally means to add from below, to add on, to supplement. And that meaning has carried over into describing the act of drinking. It is not about the first shots, but about taking more, maintaining a slight buzz, or deepening it. A podatij is someone who has already drunk, not necessarily drunk in the sense of having completely lost control, but clearly under the influence of alcohol, cheerier than normal, louder, gesturing more broadly, inclined to long philosophical monologues, or to singing songs he would not sing sober. This is an important distinction in the Russian alcohol vocabulary. The state of being podatij is a functioning, social, accepted, and even desirable state in many social contexts. Showing up at a party and not being at least a little podatij is, in many Russian social circles, something suspicious, something that requires explanation. Are you sick? Are you driving? Or do you just have something against the people gathered? Being podatij is fine. Being podatij is the norm. The third word, sinka, is a diminutive, almost affectionate form derived from the word sinij, blue, but in Russian slang it means cheap and strong alcohol, usually vodka or alcohol substitutes, drunk by people for whom only the alcohol content and the price per liter matter. Sinka is the alcohol of poverty, the alcohol of the margins, the alcohol of those who long ago crossed the line between recreational drinking and compulsive drinking and who are no longer looking for taste or company, but only for the chemical effect. The word itself sounds gentle, almost affectionate, which creates a striking contrast with what it describes. And that contrast is characteristic of the Russian attitude toward alcoholism, an attitude in which the cruelty of reality is wrapped in the cotton wool of language, as if a diminutive could lessen the drama. Sinka is also directly connected with the word siniak, a bruise, a drunkard, because chronic drinking of cheap alcohol causes a characteristic reddening and bruising of the face, making the habitual drinker recognizable from a few meters away. This is etymology brutal in its simplicity. The face turns blue from sinca, the drunkard becomes a bruise, and the circle closes in one macabre pun. The fourth word is quasich, and it is a verb that in its basic meaning refers to fermentation, to pickling, to the chemical process in which sugars turn into alcohol. In slang, quasich means to drink regularly and intensely, for a long time, without a special occasion and without a special purpose, to drink the way sauerkraut ferments, slowly, consistently, day after day, at room temperature, without hurry and without end. This word is fascinating because it transfers onto the act of drinking the metaphor of a biological process, something natural, something that simply happens. Not a decision, not a choice, but a process unfolding according to its own logic and its own rhythm. Someone who quasi does not drink because they want to get drunk. They simply quasi, just as they breathe, just as they sleep. It is a linguistic expression of the deeply Russian belief that compulsive drinking is in some sense natural, inevitable, built into reality rather than arising from will. One can quasich alone or in company. One can quasich for a week or for a year. One can quasich quietly or loudly, but always regularly and always without particular reflection on that fact. The fifth word is green serpent, and this is one of the few expressions in this set that is not merely street slang, but has its roots in literature, folklore, and the religious imagination of Russian culture. The green serpent is a personification of alcohol, alcohol as a demon, as a creature with its own will, which enters a person and rules him, which tempts, pulls in, and destroys. This image has appeared in Russian fairy tales, in 19th century literature, in painting, in sermons, in anti-alcohol journalism for centuries, and to this day functions as a metaphor for alcoholism understood not as a weakness of character, but as possession by an external force. This aspect is culturally very important. In the Russian understanding of alcoholism, the addict's responsibility is often blurred by the image of a demon that came from outside and defeated the person. The green serpent is not today a word used in everyday conversation with full seriousness. It appears more often with a hint of irony or black humor, as a cultural reference rather than a literal description. The sixth word is bormotucha, and it is one of those words that sounds like the thing it describes. Bormotucha is cheap, poor quality vermouth or a similar fruit wine, made from less than noble ingredients and sold for pennies. Alcohol that in the Soviet Union and for many years after its collapse was a mass drink, available everywhere, as cheap as decent water, and incomparably more popular than any wine from a noble grape. The name comes from the word bormotach, to mumble, to babble. And once again, we have the same ruthless precision of Russian slang. After drinking bormotucha, a person starts to babble, so the alcohol gets a name describing its effect on human speech. Bormotucha was for decades a symbol of Soviet alcoholic poverty, a symbol of a lack of choice in the literal sense, because there often simply was no choice. Because on the shelf there was bormotucha or nothing, and one chose bormotucha. The seventh word is stoparch, and it is a slang term for a shot of vodka, one measure, one hit, one portion of 100 grams of pure vodka, which in Russian drinking culture has an almost sacred status. 100 grams, in Russian 100 gram or precisely stoparch in slang, is the basic unit of Russian drinking, like the meter is the unit of length and the kilogram the unit of mass. An invitation to a stoparch is an invitation to talk, to pause for a moment, to stop and look one another in the eye. Refusing a stoparch in the proper context is a gesture as meaningful as accepting it, and both gestures require explanation. Where did the 100-gram standard come from? Some historians point to the military. The 100-gram vodka ration for soldiers in frontline conditions was officially introduced during the Second World War. The eighth word is napitstya v smert, and it is one of those expressions whose literalness might seem like hyperbole if Russian statistics did not turn that hyperbole into something disturbingly literal too often. Napitstya v smert means to drink oneself to death, not metaphorically, but to the limits of the body's physical ability to function. This is the most intense degree of intoxication in the Russian linguistic scale, a state in which a person controls nothing, remembers nothing, and sometimes truly balances on the edge, beyond which there is only the hospital or the cemetery. The Russian language has several expressions describing different degrees of intoxication with increasing intensity, and the fact that at the top of that scale stands an expression literally referring to death says something very important about how drinking limits are understood in Russian popular culture, or rather, about the fact that those limits are understood in a very blurry and very elastic way. The ninth word is samogon, and although this word is technically more the name of a product than slang describing a state or act of drinking, its presence in the Russian alcohol vocabulary is so fundamental and so culturally rich that leaving it out would be like describing Russian literature without mentioning Dostoevsky. Samogon is moonshine, a home-distilled alcohol made from potatoes, grain, beets, or anything that ferments. And in Russia, it is not so much an illegal alternative to store-bought alcohol as a parallel and in many regions, primary alcohol tradition, deeply rooted in rural and provincial culture. The word literally means self-driving. It chases itself, produces itself, works itself. And that etymology captures something important about the approach to making homemade moonshine. It is something that makes itself, something that naturally follows from the availability of ingredients and from need, without any special intervention from an external factor. The 10th word is opochmielitsa, and it is perhaps the most important word in the entire set, because it describes not the act of drinking itself, but a specifically Russian philosophy of coping with the consequences of drinking, a philosophy that has no exact equivalent in any other language or any other culture in this form. Opochmielitsa literally means to cure a hangover, only by a method that in Poland or Germany would be considered taking a shortcut, by means of another dose of alcohol. It is the concept that a hangover is cured with the very thing that caused it, that one wedge is driven out by another wedge, that the body needs another dose of the same substance in order to return to the balance that that substance disrupted. In Russian, one says that someone is going to opochmielitsa, and no one asks what that means, because everyone knows. Leave a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and be sure to watch the next video.